Hi Ron, it's Shelley here in Regina. The video that I'm going to be recording right now is going to be presented as part of my mini lesson assignment. That'll be two. So we've been talking in this particular class about children with diverse abilities and the different ways that those abilities and uniquenesses manifest themselves in folks. So the learning outcomes are broken down into focusing on different areas of differences and different areas of abilities. So this particular presentation is going to talk about the effects that stress have on children and their development and their ability to function. So today we're looking at characteristics of emotional and behavioral disorders and challenges in some of the children that you'll have opportunity to work with. This coincides with learning outcome number 3 in your manual. You'll find the information, some of the questions and whatnot from pages 53 to 58 in your manual. And it also coincides with chapter 9 in the course text. And those pages run from page 165 to 182. So let's begin. I often like to teach from quotes and to talk about things that I've read in quoted form. Often as early childhood educators, you will be working with children using developmentally appropriate practice, developmentally appropriate environments. It's also important too, when you've got those moments where you're working back and forth with a child or children, that you have also opportunities to help them develop skills in their coping, to help them develop skills in their problem-solving abilities, in making good decisions. And then also, so this quote says, as well as to build self-esteem, but in my opinion, if you're doing better at all of these things as an individual, your self-esteem tends to get a little boost. So if a child is able to function more independently, they're feeling better about themselves as a result. So then you're more likely to have them participate and want to participate more and gain that social development and emotional development. So looking at stress, coping, and crisis. A lot of the times these things go together. So thinking of yourself as an individual, if something is causing you stress, hopefully what happens is your coping mechanism kicks in. It might be going for a jog, it might be listening to music, it might be taking a bubble bath, reading a book, playing with your dog. So that's in coping. Hopefully that's the end of it. But sometimes you slip into crisis because you're just not sure how to cope with it. And crisis doesn't feel good. So crisis releases a lot of stress hormones, can cause a lot of anxiety, can cause people to lose sleep, can cause people to withdraw socially and shut down emotionally. So we really want to be focusing on abilities for a child to cope and help them improve with that. Much the same as with adults, what's stressful for one child might not be stressful for another. So never go into it with the assumption that all children are the same, especially in this regard, because one child might just love dogs and have 3 of them at home and just feel really comfortable around them. Another child might hear a bark from a dog and just be thrown over the edge with fear. So it's important to be aware of those things. So, 5 examples of stress in a child's life. And looking at these are actually things that can be quite stressful in the life of an adult as well. So you're an adult, and you have better coping skills and mechanisms as a result of your years of experience, as your maturity level increases. So thinking now of young children in your care, right? The first example of stress in a child's life, placed in daycare for the first time. I actually remember that. I'm 42 years old now. I remember the day that my mom brought me to daycare for the first time. I lasted there maybe a week. I would have such fits of panic and anxiety in the morning that my mom actually felt bad taking me there, and as a result guilted my grandmother into taking care of me while she or my dad were at work. You're out of your element. You've lost all of your adults who you see every day. You've got a new environment, new adults, a whole bunch of kids who are looking at you and wondering who you are. It can be very stressful. Number two, so not only is the breakup of a relationship stressful for the adults involved, it's also quite stressful for the children involved too. And because children are egocentric, and because they think that they play an impact on all of the decisions that are made around them, they often think that the breakup is because of them, when in fact it rarely is. So it's an erroneous, illogical thought process, but it still causes a great degree of stress. Moving. Sometimes when you're moving to a new neighborhood, even a new home, a lot of kids even find something as what you might think is as exciting as moving bedrooms can also be very stressful. Living in poverty is another one. When you've got your caregivers, if your mom or dad or whoever you happen to be living with and being raised by, if they're not sure where the money is coming from to purchase groceries so that you can eat, if they're unsure where the money is coming from to pay the utilities, to pay rent, to pay mortgage, a lot of the times they're working 1 or 2 jobs or worse, they're unemployed, so there's all of the emotional and social stigma that goes along with that and how they might be feeling about that. And all of those feelings that the adult carries, many, many times it trickles down into the children. So things like, and then secondary attributes from that. So things like you're upset because your family's upset, but then there are also things that you aren't sleeping well because you go to bed hungry, or you wake up so hungry so you haven't had a full sleep cycle. So it all is interrelated. And then finally too, the fifth one is a death in the family. Many times, even though the child is too young to understand the concept of death, they can't appreciate the sense of loss that the family is experiencing. They're sad because mommy's sad, they're sad because daddy's sad, they're sad because they're not going to see Uncle Vince anymore, that sort of thing. So there's a great deal of stress that can come along with that as well. These 5 items are not solely the only causes of stress. For some children, some of these things aren't even an issue, so there will never be a sense of stress for them. But these are the top 5, we'll say. So be keeping those in mind. So, if a child has experienced stress, they've been introduced to a stressor, they've moved into what is hopefully a coping mechanism, but they have been unable to resolve the stress, so now they've moved into crisis. So these are the factors that are going to determine if a child indeed does move into crisis mode. So looking at the first one, the stressor. What is it that's leading them to experience this sense of tension? Resistance resources. What or who do they have at their disposal that's going to help them face up to this stress, that's going to help them cope with it? Or who's missing from that equation that's going to help them get through this situation? The third item, the child's definition of a stressor. So as I mentioned a few slides back, what is a stressor to one individual might not be a stressor to another, and vice versa. And then finally the crisis. So how is it going to manifest itself? So all of these factors together are going to determine whether or not the child is moving in to a crisis situation or not. So victimization is a term that we'll use to talk about any situation that causes the child to feel powerless or at the control of another person. There are 3 types of victimization. All 3 do certainly cause stress to accrue in the life of a child. So there's 3 broad categories: pandemic, acute, and extraordinary victimizations. So the first slide that I have here, I've got some examples here off to the side. If you're interested in seeking out these particular graphics, they are all hyperlinked to the site from which they were borrowed. But back to pandemic victimizations. So when you think of the word pandemic, you think of spread wide, ample, lots. So a lot of these things happen to us as children while we're growing up, and it happens to a lot of us, and it happens frequently to us. So yet it receives very little attention. So for example, you're not always reading about pandemic victimization in the newspaper, or you're not always seeing it on the 5 o'clock news, but it's happening frequently in a lot of households and a lot of early learning and care environments. So it includes things like being assaulted by siblings, which sometimes, and I'm not talking play fighting here when kids are wrestling and having fun, I'm talking about when your brother or sister, older or younger, is putting the pucks to you, or vice versa. Peers, so kids at school, often in the form of bullying, schoolyard bullying we'll call it, and then physical punishment from parents, which this day and age is absolutely frowned upon, but it still happens. And often too, what happens with punishment from parents is that it tends to escalate. Like, it could start as a tap on the behind, but if it's not eliciting the change in the child's behavior that the parent wants, they tend to hit harder, and then it becomes rather abusive. And it's also, even if it's just a tap on the bottom, when parents are saying, "Oh, it was just a tap," it's still really, really shameful, and that's not the way that we want our kids to change their behavior. We want them to do it because they want to do it, not because someone embarrassed them or guilted them into doing it. So the big thing here, because pandemic victimizations are so darn common, a lot of the times kids with diverse needs and abilities are at the receiving end of this. Whether it's, so for example, if it's an individual who's nonverbal, they don't have the language to defend themselves. Perhaps they haven't made the social connections where their peers will come and stand up for them. But for whatever reason, kids with special needs and abilities are often victims to this. And because it happens so frequently and to so many kids, kids tend to worry about it a lot. So, looking at our second type of victimization, we have acute victimizations. So we've gone from pandemic down to a smaller part of the population. It does affect fewer kids. It includes physical abuse, but a more focused type of physical abuse. So from the first slide for pandemic, we've gone from a tap on the bum to smarten them up, to a smack on the bottom, a punch in the face, a slap in the face. It also happens in the form of neglect. So whether it's neglect of physical needs or it's neglect of emotional needs, neglect is neglect. Whether knowing or otherwise or intentional, it's still neglect. And abductions, but in the form of family abductions. So dad has abducted the children, mother has abducted the children, oftentimes taken out of the country so that they can't be as easily traced. So here, if you're reviewing this on your own, I've got some images here. This particular little girl, a number of years ago when I was watching Oprah, her name is Danielle. You can click here for the video link, so I'll click that now. Ron, I'm actually not going to click the video. It is an active link in my PowerPoint, but I just want to save time in the video, so when it posts okay. So, back into the PowerPoint. And then finally, the third form of victimization, pandemic, acute. We've gone to very specific members of the population, a very small portion of the population now. Extraordinary victimizations. So, perhaps the graphics are a clue. Happens to a very limited number of the population, but this is the stuff. The extraordinary victimizations are the things that hit the media big, that bring communities together to help locate this person or find the killer of so-and-so. And it's still very important that we do pursue these things. Yet going back to if pandemic, if there's a broad number of children who are impacted, don't you think that's where we should also be kicking up the fuss, right? But coming back to extraordinary victimizations, so, for example, child homicide. So the child has lost their life at the hands of another. and abductions, but in the form of stranger abductions. So the family has no idea who the person is that took their child. It could just be a random drive-by, scoop up a child, and away they go. So, we've looked at, especially, 5 forms of stress in the life of a child. And we've also looked at types of victimizations. 3 types of victimizations in the life of children. So I've got a little review here. So what we'll do is we'll read the questions, take a moment to speak or write down your answer, and then you can click. So if you're doing, I'll click, but if you're reviewing this at home or on your own time, you'll just click through the PowerPoint and it will reveal the answers. So this particular slide is asking you to, can you list the 5 sources of stress in the life of a child? 5 sources of stress. Take a moment. We'll pretend that 4 minutes has elapsed. So, hopefully one of the things on your list was a child being placed in daycare for the first time. Another source of stress is the breakup of a parent's marriage. The family moves to new home, new neighborhood. Actually living in poverty is a form of stress for many children. And then finally, a death in the family. All right, so the next slide, we're going to be looking at true and false. And this is around the 3 types of child victimization. So true or false is what you're going to need to answer. So click on the first item, and you can decide if this is true or false. And then we can click, and you can determine if you can correct or fix it. So the first one, 3 types of childhood victimizations include pandemic, acute, and extraordinary. Is that true or false? If you answered true, good for you. The second item, acute victimizations affect the most children. Acute victimizations affect the most children. And that would be false. Pandemic victimizations affect the most children. Number 3, extraordinary victimizations include parent abduction and neglect. So extraordinary victimizations include parent abduction and neglect. So if you recall, the last type of victimization we talked about was extraordinary. So parent abduction and neglect are characteristics of acute victimization. Number 4, pandemic victimizations tend to worry children a lot. And that's right, it's true. These are the most common types of victimization of children. Number 5, extraordinary victimizations affect the fewest children, yet receive the most publicity. Remember what I said about that? And true is the answer. And then finally, number 6, children with diverse abilities are frequently on the receiving end of pandemic victimizations. So kids with diverse abilities are frequently on the receiving end of pandemic victimizations. And that also, unfortunately, is true. So this PowerPoint is going to be posted on my courses. You are certainly free to review it and review these exercises, because chances are good that you're going to see this information again on a test, hint, hint. And then finally, as I mentioned previously, for the images that I used in this PowerPoint, if you would like to see the sites that they have come from, I've tried to make them as educational as possible. The hyperlinks are the actual photograph itself. So you can click on that and it will take you to the site. So thank you very much for your time, and we can pick up with any questions that you have after the break.